Let's talk about the sin nature. Over in John chapter 8 and verse 32, Jesus first introduces the concept of the sin nature. And he also indicates that he's going to give us what we need to have victory over the sin nature. Here in John chapter 8 and verse 32, it says, "And you will experientially know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, he's not talking about truth in general. He's talking about a very specific truth. And in John chapter 8 and verse 34, he shows that this truth is actually referring to having victory over the sin nature. And Jesus answered, "Truly, I say to you, that everyone doing these sin is a slave to sin." So if we are a slave to sin, the truth is actually going to free us from that slavery. Now, over in Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, we see that to whom we present our bodies, we are actually slaves to. So Romans 6:16 says, "Do you not intuitively know that to whom you present yourselves a slave because of obedience, slaves you are to whom you obey, either sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness." Now, Paul has just previously explained what the sin nature is and where it came from. Over in Romans chapter 5 and verse 17, where he's talking about the fact that for by the trespass of the one, death reigned through the one, to how much more the ones having received the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness in life reign through one, Jesus Christ. So in contrast to Adam's disobedience that condemned us before God, Christ's obedience actually makes us righteous before God. Now, this is because God actually attributes Christ's death and resurrection to us. And this is where we get into the doctrine of how to have victory over the sin. It's know, reckon, and yield. Over in Romans chapter 6 and verse 5, God puts to our account the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. So we have been co-buried with him so that we will be co-raised to walk in newness of life. So Romans chapter 6 and verse 5 says, "For if, assuming it is true, you have come to be planted together in the likeness of his death, indeed also we will be planted together in the likeness of his resurrection." So through what Christ did, because God now attributes that to us, we actually have life. Romans chapter 6 and verse 6 then goes on and talks about the old man, which is who we were in Adam. This has been crucified in Christ. And that's actually pretty important for us as Christians to understand, because that means that sin nature has actually been rendered ineffective. That means when our mind is focused on who we are in Christ and we're living a life that actually manifests God's opinion of us, the sin nature is rendered ineffective. That is, it can't produce what it wants to produce. Romans chapter 6 and verse 6 says, "Experientially knowing this, that our old man was co-crucified in order that the body of the sin," which is referring to the sin nature, "should be rendered ineffective, so that we are no longer slaves to the sin nature." We don't have to obey those desires that we don't want to do. But we also need to understand how to overcome those desires. Of course, part of this is actually counting this to be true. And that's where we see in Romans chapter 6 and verse 11, it says, "Thus also you should reckon yourselves to be dead, on the one hand, to be dead to the sin nature." If you're dead to something, you're not going to respond to it. But on the other hand, being ones who are alive to God in Christ Jesus. So we're not dead, we're alive unto God. We're focusing on the things of God. And then, of course, the next step is to yield your members to righteousness, not to unrighteousness. Romans chapter 6 and verse 13. "Neither present your members as instruments of unrighteousness to the sin," which would be the sin nature, "but present yourself to God as out from the dead living ones, and your members instruments of righteousness of God." So victory over the sin nature involves know, reckon, and yield. It's knowing what God has done. The impact of what he has done has freed us from slavery to the sin nature. We need to count that to be true. Now remember where the source is coming from. God does not lie. So if God says this is true, it is. So to have victory over our sin nature, what we need to do is stop trying to fight it and start yielding our members to righteousness. Start focusing on the things of God and start living those out and ignoring the desires of the sin nature. Now, of course, it takes some time. We have to grow and mature. We're not going to step into the Christian life and suddenly do everything perfectly every time. But the reality is, we actually have freedom from the sin nature. So when we're caught up in different sins, when we continue to struggle, it's because we're not taking God at His word. And we need to go back and we need to focus on that. Know that you have died with Christ and have been raised to walk in newness of life. Count that to be true. And then start yielding your members to righteousness. Start ignoring the wrong things and the wrong desires. And start seeking to do what is right so that you're living out who you are in Christ.